Hi, my name's Brendan Malone and you're watching Left Foot Media. The Road is the 2009 film directed by John Hillcoat based on the Cormac McCarthy novel from 2006 of the same name. It is about a father and a son on a journey to safety in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. And wasteland really is probably a bit of an understatement. By the way, if you haven't seen the film already, there's going to be a ton of spoilers in this review. So if you don't want anything spoiled and you're a bit late to the party and you still haven't seen The Road, go away, watch the movie, and then come back later. But when you do watch it, you'll understand what I mean when I say that this really is a wasteland. Viggo Mortensen plays the lead role of the father, and Cody Smith-McPhee plays the son. They are the two main characters in this film. It is their story, it is their journey that we follow throughout the movie. There are only a couple of other notable roles in the film, and they are Charlize Theron, who plays the mother. We see her in flashbacks, and Robert Duvall, who has a substantial scene and a very beautiful interaction with Viggo Mortensen and his son towards the end of the film. But other than that, the rest of the players in this film are very minor bit parts. It really does focus quite strongly on this journey that this father and this son have to undergo. This is one of my favourite books ever. And one of my favourite films ever. And in my humble opinion, I think it's one of the best post-apocalyptic films that has ever been made. I remember when I first read this book, and I just couldn't put it down. I just kept reading and reading and reading. I'd heard someone else who had read it before me, who was talking to me about the book, say, look, I just couldn't. I couldn't stop reading. I kept reading and reading and reading. And they're not a big reader of books, this person. They said they just couldn't put it down. And I thought, okay, we'll see. Because you often hear that from people. This book is amazing, couldn't put it down. Then you read it and you think, oh, that was okay. But this was one of those sort of rare occasions where they were actually right. It really was a book that you couldn't put down. It's not a long read, but it's just so powerful and engaging. And the way that Cormac McCarthy writes, there's just something about the gift for writing that he has that just sort of pulls you into that story. I think it's one of his best works, and the film really is a very, very, very faithful adaptation of the novel. A lot of film adaptations of books, they often fall short or they are lacking. There are a few examples that sort of prove the rule. There are exceptions to that rule, but generally book adaptations just don't quite live up to the hype, especially if it is a book that has been well read and has received a lot of accolades. You will find often that the film version, there's just something that's not quite there. Well, this film's not like that. This film is very, very faithful in its adaptation, and it brings to life the pages of that book. It's not something different. It's not trying to deviate in major ways. It is very faithful, and it really captures, I think, the essence in a profoundly immersive way of the book that Cormac McCarthy wrote. It is, as a film, as I said, very, very immersive. It's the kind of film that stays with you, even hours after you've finished watching it. I was watching it again the other night, taking notes and preparing for this video commentary today about The Road, and I am still sitting in that movie a day or so later. It is that sort of immersive experience. I think there's a lot of reasons for this. I think it's just a great example of filmic storytelling. So first of all, the story itself is phenomenal. The book that this movie is based on and is a very faithful adaptation of, the story is really something quite special. It's not your typical sort of post-apocalyptic stuff. It deals a lot in metaphors and it goes deep. It's a lot of post-apocalyptic films, they might have deep things to say, or there's moments or aspects. It's a genre, interestingly enough, where you can actually use to go a bit deeper, I think, into the human experience and really sort of strip away some of the superficiality when it's done well. Often it doesn't quite do that, though. This book and this film really does go deep. And you could really say that effectively the post-apocalyptic wasteland that they're in, the world that they inhabit, it's really the canvas. And it's simply a canvas upon which this painting is painted. And the painting is not about the post-apocalyptic wasteland. The painting is about the relationship between father and between sun, which we'll talk more about in just a moment. The acting in this is amazing. Viggo Mortensen is just phenomenal. He is a really good actor, and in this role, he is just amazing. And there's something about the way that this film is directed, which really adds to that. And there's almost a sort of a naturalism to it. It's not overhyped. It's a film where, as I said, you find yourself engaged with these characters in a unique kind of way. It almost has a bit of an indie vibe to it, despite the fact that this film is its scope and its scale it's huge. It's the end of the world, and you really are immersed in that world. It's not sort of in a small, tiny location while the world is collapsing. That you actually see that world and you journey through that world. But the acting has a real intimacy to it. And that's really important. We'll talk more about why I think that's important in a moment when you sort of get to some of the deeper points in the story. The visuals are absolutely astounding in this film. The cinematography by Javier Aguirre-Esarobe, and I'm probably not pronouncing his last name correctly, but that's me having my best stab at it. Most recently he worked on Thor, and so these two films, Thor and The Road, they could not be any more different in their visual look. Thor is just so brightly coloured and sort of positive and hopeful. This one is bleak and dreary and grey. But I really love the visuals in this film. The visuals in this film, I think, are absolutely essential to the story. They, as I said, they're part of the canvas upon which the story is told. And I will speak more in a moment about why I think these visuals are essential. But basically what they do is they very much ground us in a world that is bleak. But the story itself is not bleak. The story is full of hope. But in order to have that contrast, you need to have a visual world that really is stark, that is broken. There is a darkness, there is a sickness, there is a deficiency there. And the visuals in this film absolutely capture that in really quite an amazing kind of way. The sound design in this film is amazing. And it's a really important part to the film. The way sound is used is really, really important to give you a sense. Again, this really helps to immerse you in the story. The trees, the earthquakes, the sounds that are not present are as important as the sounds that are present. And this film, the sound design is really, really amazing. The costuming in this film is something else. A lot of post-apocalyptic films and television, when you think about the costumes, they have something about them that's just not quite right. They are often a very or far too clean rendering into the real world of an artist's design of post-apocalyptic costumes. And you probably know what I mean. The sort of costuming that looks like it could be right, but it doesn't really look like it's been worn in this world. It's too new, it's too fresh, it's too clean. There's just something that's not quite right. The costuming in this, and particularly the dirt and the grime and the clothes they wear, the way they are made up as characters, the dirt and grime and the wear and tear in their costumes is just so palpable. You can almost smell it. You can almost feel that grit. It really is something quite amazing. Again, it adds to the visual look of this, and it steeps you in a really important way, I think, in the reality of the darkness and the brutality of this world that they inhabit. And it brings you into that grey, bleak world where so much of what has come before or was before has been lost. And the costuming is a very powerful way of showing that. And these costumes look almost like a documentarian documenting real people and the real clothes that they would wear in this world. It really is something quite special. The soundtrack by Nick Cave and Warren Ellis, it really is a good soundtrack. And for me, I can't imagine this world with any other soundtrack. It is just so perfect for this world. They have a unique sort of cinematic quirkiness, the way that they use strings, those two composers, when they work together. And this film, they have maximized, I think, to the full effect, that particular and unique sort of artistic and musical styling that they have as composers. Interestingly enough, if you go and watch the 2010 film Stakeland, it looks and sounds suspiciously to me like they have ripped off one of the core musical signatures and motifs that Nick Cave and Warren Ellis use in The Road. I could be wrong. It could be pure coincidence. But there is a very, 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 very strong similarity. If you haven't seen Stakeland, it's an independent sort of vampire hunter type movie. Again, it's a post-apocalyptic story about a boy and a surrogate father, and on a journey. So there's a lot of similarities. I think it's a good film in its own right. But it's interesting when you look at the soundtrack. It does seem that they were taking their cues from The Road. Go on YouTube or Google the soundtrack for Stakeland and have a contrast and have a listen between the two if you don't and haven't seen that film and don't understand what I'm talking about. But the soundtrack is just something special as well. Basically, all of that comes together. So you have your story, you have your acting, your directing, the visuals, the sound design, the costumes, and the soundtrack, the musical scoring of this film. They all come together in this amazing way to produce what I think is cinema at its most perfect. It takes full advantage of filmic storytelling and the way the cinematic medium allows you to tell a story in a profoundly immersive way that you don't get. You don't get from just reading a book. When you read a book, you don't hear voices. You don't see things. Now, there's something important and I think probably really quite beautiful about reading a book in the way that your imagination draws you into the world. Don't get me wrong, I'm not downplaying that. But the way that a film allows you to add music to that, to bring a visual representation to all of that, to add things like sound design in the world that you don't get when you're reading a book, all these kind of things. And this film is a great example of a film that actually uses cinematic storytelling, I think, to its perfection. And what it does is it immerses you in the story. As I said, you shut off this film and it still stays with you. You sort of, in a sense, you feel the grime of this world. You wear this film and what it has to say. Ultimately, I think this is a very beautiful piece of visual poetry. Interestingly enough, the 2019 film Ad Astra, starring Brad Pitt, I see this as a bit of a sister movie to The Road. It's a companion film to The Road. In Ad Astra, you have a son who is journeying to try and find his older father. So you have an adult son with a much older father, and he's trying to get to his father. And the relationship they have is really the exact opposite. It's like the polar opposite of the relationship we see between the father and the son in The Road. But really, they are telling the same story. They are films about the importance of the relationship between fathers and their sons, between fathers and their children, the way that the father shapes the child, and they just go about that important theme in two very different ways. In The Road, it presents a model, a beautiful lived-out model of the father in a total act of self-giving love for his son. In Ad Astra, we see the absence of that self-giving fatherly love and a father who is deficient, and how that has negatively impacted the son. So in The Road, you see the positive impact. In Ad Astra, you see the loss, the deficiency, the loss of that light, and how that produces harm in the life of the son. It's quite interesting to see these two films. And there's also other similarities as well. The way they are, as I said, they're really journey films about people on journeys. And there's a lot of narration in both films. You have your main characters who are narrating and there's an inner monologue that's really being lived out as the story is told. There are several major themes in this film, The Road, which I think elevate it well above your average post-apocalyptic storytelling. So let's look a little bit more deeply at some of those themes. First of all, there is the theme of hope. This is a profoundly important aspect of the story. It's kind of weird. I often describe this film to people as being the most bleak but beautiful film that you will ever watch. The world is bleak. The evil in this world is not nice. But what is at the center of the story is not that evil and not that bleakness, but the hope that the father holds and he is transmitting to his son as they go on this journey together in the story. And it's just so very beautifully told. There's an interesting contrast in the story between the mother and the father, the mother played by Charlize Theron. I often wonder actually now whether or not this film would get made today in the same way, whether it would get greenlit with this portrayal of the mother as it is currently in the film. I think the portrayal is perfect, it's faithful, but I suspect that what you would have today is the studios would say, well, you need to rewrite that character of the wife, and she needs to be a bit more of a sympathetic character. But the wife basically loses hope. We see this in flashbacks, and she takes her own life. And it is so graphically, there's no gratuitous violence, but the portrayal of her hopelessness, her loss of hope, and her fall into despair is so graphically and profoundly portrayed. It really sticks with you. Her character, she just gets to a point where she has lost all hope and she wants suicide, and she wants them to commit suicide together. And the father, on the other hand, holds on to the hope and says, no, we must live this life. Even in this darkness and brutality, we must live this life for our son, and because this is the good and the right thing to do, even if he doesn't say that in so many words. But she's lost that hope, and she ends up, in this film, she takes her own life. That's how much the despair overwhelms her. As I said, I wonder today whether the same character would actually be allowed to be put to screen, or whether they would demand that in actual fact you portray her in a more sympathetic kind of way, and perhaps her death was not at her own hands, instead that perhaps something else took her instead. But I think it's really important to the story because it provides an important contrast. And the way in which the father holds hope for his son and hope for the world is really quite profoundly important. It's a big part of the story. It's the thing that really keeps the journey moving, is the hope of something better, the hope of being able to give a legacy to the son. It's an essential theme in this film. Just on a side note, I actually wonder whether or not there's a bit of a metaphor for divorce going on here too. It seems to me that relationship breakdown is certainly a very powerful metaphor, whether or not it's something real that Cormac McCarthy was writing from something he knew, or whether it's just something that he's sort of touching on. But it does seem very, very clear. You see this in the flashbacks. There is this break and breakdown in the relationship between the father and the mother and their relationship. And the piano that you see in this film is very much a metaphor. It's a visual symbol of the love between the two of them. You see them at the piano together in the beginning of these story flashbacks, and there's a duet. They are both playing this piano together. The idea of this beautiful music that they create together, that's a very common and a very old metaphor for love. You know, being a form of music and a beautiful sort of symphony that two people, a husband and a wife, compose together, and a man and a woman, in a very profound and beautiful kind of way. And so it's not surprising that the piano would be sort of the symbol of that. And then we move a bit further along in the story as the apocalypse is unfolding, and Viggo Mortensen is forced to actually smash up the piano. They need the wood of the piano. And so here's the symbol of the love, of the relationship they share, and it's being visually broken down and destroyed. And then there is a scene a bit further on after they visit the cannibal house in the film, and they find a piano that's intact. And Viggo Mortensen plays a couple of notes on the piano, and then he just breaks down with this overwhelming sense of sorrow and sadness. Again, it's that piano, it's that sense of this love, this relationship which is broken down, and there's something that's been lost between them. It's a really sort of beautiful visual portrayal of that, but very much a strong aspect of the story between the husband and the wife, the mother and the father. You sort of get the sense that there is that divorce is very much possibly something he's thinking of here, and also the way in which you see a bit later on in the film, he talks to his son about we have to let her go, we have to let the mother go. And there's a scene where he takes his wedding ring off and he leaves it on a ledge. It's so beautifully shot, that, and the way it's just this beautiful piece of visual poetry. He can't bring himself just to flick the thing off the edge or throw it into the abyss. He just sort of pushes it away, but it sits there and stays there. He can't do that next thing. Again, I think that speaks volumes about the fact that he is himself a truly good man. He has this goodness inside of him. He can't be bitter and angry and resentful, even though he has to move forward with his son. This is not about him raging or hating his wife. This is about him letting go of something in order that he can move forward with his son. And it's just so beautifully portrayed in that little scene after they have the night where they sleep in the truck, where he just puts it on the edge and pushes it gently, but doesn't flick it off, doesn't throw it off, doesn't push it off the edge. Fatherhood is another essential theme that is central to the story in The Road. And I think this is one of the most beautiful portrayals of fatherly devotion that has ever been put to screen. It's beautiful because of the honesty and the raw nature of what this relationship is. And there's this sort of this very messy imperfection between the father and the son. The father is not perfect. He is striving to be virtuous. He is striving to do the right thing, but there are plenty of mistakes and missteps along the way. And that is the true reality of a relationship between a father and a child. The relationship is one where, and I say this as a father myself, you strive to be a good man, you strive to be a good father, but you make so many mistakes along the way. And a big part of it is journeying with your children. I've heard this talked about a lot before, about the importance of rupture and repair in a relationship, and particularly in parenting. This is really important. If you have a perfect relationship where there's no rupture and therefore no need to repair it, the relationship is not quite as strong. But when you have these ruptures, when as a father you make these mistakes, when things get messy, when you need to go to your children and actually say sorry or ask forgiveness for something that you've done. So you have a rupture and then you have a repair. And the repair is that moment where you go and seek forgiveness, where you ask and you say sorry to your children for what you might have done. And there is forgiveness and there is repair. And what happens is that relationship is much stronger than a relationship that's never had the rupture and the repair. And this film really gets to the messy heart of that sort of fatherly relationship. It's a very, very beautiful and I think honest portrayal of that. In a 2007 interview that Cormac McCarthy did, he stated that in actual fact there were conversations in this book between the father and the son that were real conversations that he'd had with his own son, John Francis. And he talked about the fact that John Francis was a co-author really to this book. And it's quite interesting. I'm not surprised by that because, as I said, if you've ever been a parent yourself and you've ever had those kind of real conversations with your kids that kids want to ask you, you'll recognize in this film a lot of that reality is played out. As I said, it's a raw and a brutal kind of honesty. The father is not perfect. And he needs the son just as much as the son needs him. The son needs to be taught by the father, but the father also needs to learn profound and important wisdom from the son. It's not the wisdom of the kid teaching knowledge to the father in the way that the father does to the son. It is the way in which the son is a beacon of self-giving love. He is a beacon which calls the father out of himself to self-giving love, to learn what it is to be authentically human and to flourish more fully by giving of himself. And he has to learn what is good, true, and beautiful through this relationship that he has with the son, and we see that journey very, very much portrayed. The son has to learn about the beginnings of what is good, true, and beautiful from the father, who then translates this into these various life lessons that he is teaching to the son. And there's this sort of beautiful mundane moments that actually make up this post-apocalyptic film, which really portray this quite well. There's a scene in the bunker where they discover that fully stocked bunker towards the end of the film, and it's a very real and honest dad moment that we have, where they find this bunker that is this probably this doomsday prepper. It's full of all of these amazing supplies, and the dad just lets his son go nuts and stuff himself to the point of being overfull with all of these treat type foods. And it's a real typical sort of thing that we do as dads. We take our kids out and we treat them to things, and we probably let them do things that they shouldn't really be doing. They're not in their best interests health-wise, but it's sort of part of the charm of fatherhood, if you like. And this film captures that. In this bleak, awful post-apocalyptic world, you still have this moment, this very ordinary, everyday moment that lots and lots of dads throughout the world will repeat today and tomorrow and the next day, of a dad who treats his kid and lets them do something that probably normally the rules would say that you shouldn't do. There's that scene with Robert Duvall, and it's such a beautiful piece of dialogue between the two of them. And you have this older father, played by Robert Duvall, of a deceased son. He's now an old man, and he's talking to this younger father, and the wisdom that sort of flows between them, and the sort of the philosophy of life, and grappling with the struggles and the challenges of this world. It's very real stuff. And the older you get as a father, the more you begin to discover this stuff and just how important this really is. One of my favourite lines in the movie, and we have this at the very beginning, the sort of the monologue that Viggo Mortensen's character, the father, starts with. And he says this beautiful line where he says, "All I know is the child is my warrant. And if he is not the word of God, then God never spoke." It is a profoundly beautiful line about authentic parenthood, authentic fatherhood, and motherhood obviously as well, and the way in which our children call us into this relationship of love, and the way in which our children show us about something that is beyond us, something profoundly good, true, and beautiful, in a very real and tangible, but very sacred and even mysterious kind of way. There's something very, very beautiful and important about the gift of family in our world. Another theme that is really important in The Road is that of death. Death is the ever-present threat in this world, and the world itself is literally dying around them. Everything is dying and breaking down. It is about a journey towards death and a journey through death. That's very much the visual metaphor in this film. There is this barbarity and murder, which also involves cannibalism. We're told it's the great threat in this story. And so you have murder and barbarism there. Again, brutal, barbaric death. And then lastly, the father in the story, he's literally dying, and he does die in the story. Death is a central theme in The Road, and a very, very important one. And that whole idea of how do I prepare my son for that moment? How do I prepare my children for that moment when I am no longer with them? It's a very, very important question that we must ask ourselves as fathers and mothers. But interestingly enough, it's a question that is not really encouraged of us by our culture to ask or to think about too deeply. Instead, our culture is so very, very superficial and stuck in such a cycle of self-gratification. It is now afraid of death. It does not like talking about it, does not like focusing on it. We don't see a lot of death. We have become very much a people who are afraid of death and of dying, and so we are not encouraged in the sort of what you might call the popular public sphere to think deeply about these questions and to contemplate them, but they are so profoundly important. And when we contemplate these things, they put us on a very important journey. We are not vampires, and the world would be a very, very unhealthy and awful place if we were vampires. There's something important about death. Thomas Aquinas talks about this, the idea that death, in one sense, is an evil. It's a sense of loss and privation. Something is missing that is good, that should be there. But at the same time, there is also something in it which is a good, in the sense that it motivates us and calls us to actually take hold of life and live it to the fullest. And I don't mean in a self-gratifying way. I mean with a sense of how do we try and live out the fullness of our humanity and our human flourishing. And that's really found through self-giving love. And that's the sort of the relationship at the center of this film. But to actually get to that point, you've got to actually embrace that reality, that death is an ever-present reality. It could come for us at any moment. It is a natural part of the human experience. And when you have children, it is a journey that we, as the parents who will one day die, it is a journey that we will also take with them. It's a journey that they must go on with us. And that's really what this film is all about. It's about a journey of dying and of new life. It's not bleak, it's not despair. It's about the hope that comes through that. The death scene in this film is profoundly moving. They actually dedicate a reasonable portion of time to that all playing out. It's very powerful. It's a very moving exploration of the death of a father, and there's great intimacy in the way that scene is shot. The camera angles, they come in very close. And what you see is this boy who has journeyed with his father and has an otherworldly sort of maturity about him, in a sense, as they go through this dark and bleak world because of the difficulties and challenges of this world. But all of a sudden, in this instant where the father is dying, he very much becomes a very, very vulnerable young child again. And we see him clinging to the father. And this is, I have to say that in my own father, who died 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago, he died in January 2018. And my father, at the death of my father, it was very much that same sort of sense. Here I was as an older man who all of a sudden felt a sort of vulnerability, a boyish sort of vulnerability in the world. My father had gone. It's a profound thing, the death of a father, and this film, I think, really captures that in a beautiful way. And now you have the sense of the son who must now chart his own course as he moves forward based on the legacy that has been given to him by the father. But death is the great leveler, it is the great threat, it is this ever-present reality, and it's the thing that brings them to that point in the journey. And lastly, there is the theme of virtue, and I think this is one of the really big and very, very important themes of this story. It just, from the very beginning to the very end, virtue is so essential to the journey that the father and the son are on, and we keep going back to this question of virtue and being virtuous in the world. So, first of all, there is the ever-present threat of cannibalism. It is the great fear, it is the great threat, as we are told at the beginning of the story. The fact that this father and this son do not engage in cannibalism is a profound mark of their goodness. They have not lost sight of truth, and they cling to that truth. It is a profound witness to their virtue. They do not participate in this vile and atrocious degrading of themselves and of the other human persons who are the victims of that brutal barbarism, which is cannibalism. So that's a profoundly important thing. There's a scene at the beginning where the wife makes this comment about other families are doing it, and the father says, no way, we're not going to do that. And it's interesting because when you watch the film the first time, you sort of think, is this her talking about suicide? Should they have a suicide pact together? And then you go back and you think, this could also equally be about cannibalism. Is that what she's asking? But either way, the father says no. He says, no, we're not going to do that. It's very much a very simple but very bold declaration of the fact that they are going to commit themselves to virtue in the world. They are not going to be just like everyone else. They're not going to be one of those dead fish that just goes with the flow. They will swim against the tide, no matter how difficult that might be. And then we have this whole thing of carrying the fire within them. And it's a profoundly important question, and it's something that the father has taught to the son, that they must keep the fire alive inside of themselves. What is this fire? This is the fire of virtue. And you see the son at one point asking the father, are we still the good guys? We're supposed to keep the fire alive inside of us, and we're supposed to protect this fire. Are we still the good guys? And it's a theme that is touched on several times in this film. How do we know we're the good guys? And there's this really important little incident that plays out where they are robbed at one point. And they catch up with the man who has robbed them, and then the father at gunpoint makes the robber take off all of his clothes and his shoes. Now, shoes are very, very important in this world. You realize in this story how essential it is to have shoes. They're a very, very important thing to have. And so he takes everything off him, including his shoes. He's got no clothes, which is really, really important, and no shoes in this world. And they leave him naked effectively, it's like a moment of revenge for what he's done to them. Now, he's done it because he's desperate. He's just taken their stuff. He hasn't harmed them physically, but he's taken their cart and the resources that they have, and he's left with it for himself out of desperation. They catch up with him, they take it all back, and then they make him strip and they take away his clothes. And the father and the son then have this really interesting and very important dialogue where the son's really challenging the father about whether or not this is actually virtuous what they've done. And the father realizes through the son and his questioning, maybe we aren't the good guys if we act this way. It's not the end justifies the means. It's not survival of the fittest. We're supposed to be virtuous. And so he leaves the man's clothes and shoes, and even they leave some food supply there for him as well, as a sort of a gesture and a sign of the fact that they are not like the others in this world who have fallen prey to this darkness and this self-gratification. They are striving to live virtue. They're not perfect at it, but that's what they're striving to do. And there's this beautiful line in the beginning of the film, again in that opening monologue, where he says this: "Sometimes I tell the boy old stories of courage and justice, difficult as they are to remember." So in other words, in this world where law and order, where civilization, where society, where basic humanity has broken down in so many ways, these stories of courage and justice, of virtue, are difficult to remember, but they must be imparted to my son. I must impart this knowledge to my son. It's so essential, so important that he understands the virtues. And there's something really beautiful and important about this, and it is such a true reflection, I think, of the world today, that within the family is really where virtuous societies are built. It's within the intimacy of the family. It's fathers and mothers transmitting to their sons and their daughters and teaching them how to live out the life of virtue. And often the families that are actively striving to do this, they are in a minority often. And it is so essential, though, that this happens, and we need more families doing this. And in today's world, as I said, you see this sort of similar situation where in this story, the father and the son almost seem like very isolated characters. They're the sort of the very, very, very odd ones out who are striving to live this virtue. As the story progresses, we discover there are others, of course, but they are very much, it's like small pockets. They're in the minority. And that's very much true of our world today, but it's so profoundly important, and virtue is so essential to the story, and particularly the virtue of love. I see this film as an extremely powerful and very important metaphor for the human experience and for human society, and particularly for what is going on in the West right now. I think one of the big things that this film reminds us of is that mere survival is not enough, that love is absolutely essential, and without love, there can be no human flourishing at all. It's so very, very essential to the story. And that's what elevates this, I think, above a lot of other post-apocalyptic stories. A lot of other post-apocalyptic stories, they are almost like thought experiments, where you would say, imagine a world where law and order had broken down and there was only a certain amount of food. Would it be okay to kill other people or do horrible things to other people in order to save yourself? And it feels like a lot of other survival films, that's the model that they adapt. This film is going much, much deeper. And this film is really trying to say to us that without love, that food, even if you happen to be the one that has it, those resources, they don't mean a thing. They are nothing without love. Love is essential to human flourishing, and mere survival is not enough. And if we want to live out a full humanity, not just one where we're surviving, survival of the fittest, we might be the top dog, the top of the heap, the top of the ladder. But if we lack virtue, we've stomped all over other people to get to that position, and we are living out a life of self-gratification, then we are not living the fullness of human flourishing. We are not living the fullness of the human experience, and we are not going to find deeper meaning and happiness in this world. Remember that opening line where he says, all I know is the child is my warrant. And if he is not the word of God, then God never spoke. A profoundly important line. This idea of self-giving love. God is love, one of the oldest sayings in the history of Christendom. And it's really the love that this relationship between father and son brings into the world and makes present in a very profound and tangible kind of way. It's one thing to talk about self-giving love, it is another thing to live it. And children are the most profound vehicle for drawing that self-giving love out of ourselves. Because for most people, that's how it will happen in their world. Most people are not going to rush to the other side of the world and set up homes for poor and dying people, or orphanages and places for the destitute. Most people are going to live in this world and live through the sort of what you might call the ordinary aspects of the human experience. Marriage and family life is one of those ordinary experiences which might at the surface level look very mundane, but is profoundly important for bringing that self-giving love into the world, because the relationship between a father and a child, a mother and a child, it draws us out of ourselves in a way that nothing else does. It teaches us to love, to become more authentic lovers of other people in a way that nothing else can do. It's just, there's something so important to the world about this, and that line is really getting at that point, the tangible way in which God, who is love, is brought into the world through that relationship between father and son, between mother and child, between father and child. As you read this book and you watch this film, for me certainly, I was very much reminded of Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. If you haven't read Man's Search for Meaning, you must read Man's Search for Meaning. Everyone should read this book. I recommend this book to people wherever I go. When I'm doing public speaking engagements, when I'm talking to people in conversations, I always say to them, have you read Man's Search for Meaning? You should read it. It is the most unique self-help, quote-unquote, book you'll ever read. It's not really a traditional, superficial accounting for life that you normally get in those sort of very, basic self-help type books. This is not Tony Robbins. Viktor Frankl is a psychologist who ended up spending time in 5 different Nazi concentration camps as a Jewish man, a Jewish prisoner. He lost his wife and his unborn child at Auschwitz, and this book, which is not a long read, but the first 2/3 of the book is him documenting and giving an account of his life in those camps. Now, what's really important about this is that one of the big themes in Viktor Frankl is the idea of hope, and that hope is still to be found even in the most dark, brutal and bleak of circumstances. And he talks about this in the book, about even in those camps which you look at and you see the photographs of, and you see the darkness and the barbarity and the brutality and the degradation of human persons that goes on in these places. He says, for those of us who lived in them, there were still moments of hope. We still were able to find and to cling to hope and to live meaning even in the midst of that darkness. It's a very, very important thing. And in this film, interestingly enough, you see when they go into that cannibal house where they have it's the dungeon, the underground prison, where they have those people that they have captured and are keeping to eat as food. For me, that was very, very reminiscent of the Holocaust and those Nazi death camps. That imagery is very, very powerful, and it is very, very much tied, I think, in the last 150 years or so, it is tied to the Nazi horrors. And so this film, I think, whether it's an intentional thing or not, what it does is you can't help but be reminded of that. And very much, it's not just that, but there's this whole theme of self-giving love and meaning in the world and hope, which is so essential to what Viktor Frankl is talking about in his book. You see in that house also, there's that pile of shoes. There's as I said, the underground dungeon where people are being treated like cattle. It's very reminiscent of the Holocaust, which is the major theme of Viktor Frankl's work. But also, there's this idea of hope. And one of the things that Viktor Frankl talks about in his book is how we need to avoid the 2 extremes that are present in the world today that are very common, these ideological extremes. One is the will to pleasure, the other is the will to power. The will to pleasure, of course, is Sigmund Freud, and this idea of your personal happiness is the way, is the path to living a full and meaningful life. The will to pleasure. What can I do to self-gratify? And if I do that, then I'll live a happy life. He He said that's an extreme and you've got to avoid it. That's not how you find authentic meaning, and it's not how you find hope and the fullness of human flourishing. The other extreme is the will to power, which is, of course, Friedrich Nietzsche, the idea of the Ubermen, the strong men, the overmen who will lead us, who will, you don't let this, what Nietzsche saw Christian morality with its too much of a focus. He thought on compassion and mercy and love. He thought these things held us back. And that what we actually need is to shed those things, to throw those things off, and that's how society will move forward. He's very much with the death of God, that God is dead and we have killed him, ideologically speaking, and there's a problem with that. Where are we going to find our morality and our meaning in life now? And he's trying to come up with an alternative solution. His solution is atrocious. His solution is not the answer, and whether he intended it or not, his solution ends up becoming very much the underpinning of the Nazi movement. They are very much, the whole idea of the will to power is very much an essential component of what Nazism was. And so Viktor Frankl, who's lived through this, says we've got to avoid those two extremes. And what we need to find is a will to meaning. And when you read the book, what you realize is what he's talking about is really ultimately about self-giving love. A will to meaning is found in other persons, in community, in relationship, and relationships of love. And you see this in this film very powerfully, because think about the cannibals. And what have the cannibals done? The cannibals have surrendered to both a will to pleasure and a will to power. Self-gratification. And they are self-gratifiers who are willing to dominate the vulnerable and to brutalize them. They have lost all respect and regard for human dignity. Other human persons are nothing more than cattle to them. That is why that scene in the house, the cannibal house, is so very reminiscent of the Holocaust. This pile of shoes, these people who are treated like cattle, and these human persons who dominate and lord it over these people. But they don't look like weird kind of monsters. They look very ordinary, but they are doing the most barbaric thing. They have given in to the will to pleasure, to self-gratification, and the will to power is the means by which they will obtain that self-gratification. They will dominate the vulnerable, and they will slaughter them, and they will consume them. They will consume the vulnerable in their lust for self-gratification. Another thing that this story reminds me of is an essay written by Hilaire Belloc in the 1930s called The New Paganism. And in this essay, he talked about and warned about the rise of what he called the new paganism. And he said, the old paganism, the gods were false, but at least they had a sense of virtue and objectivity to this world, and so there is still something there that is good. But he said the new paganism is not like this. The new paganism is very much mired in relativism, and the gods are not just false, but there is no virtue in the new paganism either. And the new paganism has married itself up with technology, and the end result, Hilaire Belloc warned, would be that the sacrifice on the altar of the new paganism would be human dignity. And you very much see this in the story. Human dignity and literally human beings are sacrificed by these other people who consume them. They are the self-gratifiers. Hilaire Belloc put it like this: the new paganism advances over the modern world like a blight over a harvest. You may see it in building, in drawing, in letters, in morals. And that is very much what you see in this world of the road, this broken down, dysfunctional, barbaric world. And constantly you are reminded, everywhere we see them journey, they are reminded these little moments of bloodshed and where people have been eaten and killed. It's a constant visual reminder throughout this world. And you see this blight that has fallen upon this world. There's an interesting scene in the book which didn't make it into the movie, and I totally understand why it didn't make it into the movie, but I think it's a very, very important one. And there's a scene in the book which happens where the father and the son hear another campsite sort of close by to them overnight. And then in the morning they walk past the campfire and they discover that there has been a woman who was there, and there was I can't remember, there's one or two other males, but you've got this very, very small group of people. And what they've done is, you can see this in the campfire, the remains of the campfire, that they have consumed a baby. They have eaten a baby. They have killed and eaten this baby. So there's very much the idea of human sacrifice that's present in that that little moment in the story. It's very brief. But I think I also see this as touching on, again, whether it's intentional by Cormac McCarthy or not, but I see this as a metaphor for things like abortion, where on the altar of new paganism, human beings are literally being sacrificed for the good of the harvest, quote unquote. We will get a good outcome. We will gain the self-gratification and the pleasure we want in this world, and all we have to do is offer up a human sacrifice to our ideological gods. If we offer up our child to the God of choice, we will find pleasure in this world. We will maximize our career. We will maximize our future outcomes. And we will do that through the human sacrifice of a child on this altar of choice, to the God of choice. And I see that metaphor, I think, very much present in the literary story of The Road. As I said, that scene is not in the film, and I understand why. I think, obviously you're telling a story, you're trying to be, in a film it's a bit different, and the way you trim certain things out to make the film lean, mean, and to keep the story flowing. But I think also probably visually, to actually see that visually in a film, I think that just, for a lot of people, it would have been perhaps come across as a bit gratuitous, a scene too far. But nonetheless, this is a profoundly beautiful film, a profoundly important film. As I said, it rises above what you might call your typical post-apocalyptic storytelling. This is not about a thought experiment. What would you do if this happened? This is very much an essay and a beautiful piece of visual poetry about how we ought to live in the world if we want to be authentically human. And it's such a profound exploration of fatherhood, of virtue, of hope, and of the question of death. Like I said, it's a film where I tell people this is a bleak film, but it is the most beautiful film you will see about virtue and about fatherhood and about authentic love in the world. Despite the fact that they live in this bleak world, they have not been tainted by that darkness. They live a light. They keep that fire alive, and they take that fire with them as they journey through that world. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comments section below. And please, if you like the content I'm creating, please support the channel. There is a link for PayPal below, or there's one found above on my home screen that you can click on. You can also support this channel through Patreon or Subscribestar. I really appreciate all of that support. It helps me to keep this content coming and to keep making more of it. So a huge thank you to everyone who's contributing. You can leave any amount at all in the tip jar below the PayPal, no matter how little you might think it is. Every little bit helps. So a huge thank you. It's helping to keep the channel going. As I said, please don't forget to leave your comments below. Tell me what you think about The Road. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.